Dr. Susan McDaniel is a Canada Research Chair, Tier 1 in Global Population and Life Course. She is also the Prentice Institute Chair, the first endowed research chair at the University of Lethbridge. She's also a director of the Prentice Institute and a professor of sociology here at the University of Lethbridge. Prior to her current positions, Susan was a professor of sociology at the University of Alberta and Waterloo, and also was a senior investigator and professor at the Institute of Public and International Affairs, University of Utah. At the University of Alberta, Susan still holds the honorific lifetime title as Distinguished University Professor. Her current research is on life course, demographic aging, health well-being, healthcare, generational relationship, family changes in global comparative perspective, and international migrations and care work. She is the principal investigator of a study of midlife inequality in Canada and the United States, funded by SHEC, and co-investigator on 2 research projects funded by SHEC on social engagement and on living on low income across generations. She is also doing funded research in Japan, Korea, Singapore, and the European Union. She's the author of 7 books and research monographs, over 190 research articles and book chapters. Dr. Susan McDaniel is a recipient of many research and teaching awards. For most of us sitting here, this will be a super accomplished. But then, as if these are not enough, Susan McDaniel goes ahead to do the following. And I will just mention a few. She's a frequent keynote speaker at national and international conferences, and a frequent advisor to government Canada, the United Kingdom, and EU. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and serves on the editorial board of 10 journals. She serves as a vice chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Canadian Council of Academies. And in January 2014, she will become the chair of the community. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, my friend, and in the animal kingdom, my mother-in-law, Susan.
Okay, what I'm going to talk with you about today, if I can master this new equipment, is I'm going to stand up because it's easier to see people and because I'm used to dancing around. Is a project that's just beginning, so you won't have heard any of this before. But because it's just beginning and it's a major project, and I will tell you about that, it's not an empirical paper because we don't have empirical results yet. So it's more of a conceptual kind of overview of this big project. So that's what we're going to talk about. Oh, we have to do this, do we? Oh, cute. What am I doing wrong here? Oh, there we go. Okay, push the wrong button. Sorry, this is new equipment. We finally got it installed. The project began life, and I have this baby up here. I'll tell you why the baby's there in a moment. But it began life with a co-authored conference paper that we were invited to do. Sanji, who you remember was a postdoc here. The baby is there because she had a baby since she left here, and that's why she left here. But she's still involved in our work at the Prentice, so we're still writing a number of papers and articles and a book, actually, which is almost finished. We were invited to do a paper at the International Symposium on Transnational Ageing at the University of Mainz in Germany. And this essentially was the beginning of this big project, which has now gotten a life of its own. There's Sonji, in case you didn't remember her. Anyone who risks being a postdoc at the Prentice goes out into the world and does bird watching. So Willa, beware, you're next. Because, of course, here's Sarah doing the same kind of thing. And so Willa, you're going to be next, of course. Okay. But we got Cheryl Curry out there, too, watching the birds. So that's what happens when you're a postdoc at the Prentice. Okay, the idea, as I mentioned, is a kind of a counterintuitive idea. but it grew into a major SSHRC grant, which I understand from what the university tells me they're going to do some kind of special story on it in the press, but hasn't happened yet. It was awarded in the spring. It's a SSHRC partnership grant. We've been working on it for several years because we had to go through multiple adjudication processes. And finally we got it in spring 2013. It's for $2.85 million. That's not a typo, that's what it is. And the project has several parts, and I'm heading one project within this big thing, so we don't get all the money. So anybody thinks we're having all the money, we don't get it. But nonetheless, this is a big project. Ito Pang at the University of Toronto is the principal investigator. I'm a co-investigator. And my project that I'm leading on is loosely called Demand and Supply of Care Workers in Inequality Contexts. So I'm going to go through some of that and what it means and how we came to this and what some of our research questions are. The focus is specifically on North America and East Asia. So we're not trying to take on the world, we're just focusing on these countries. And we're not presuming migration streams going in a particular direction, and my project has a specific focus. So we're not taking on all of the transnational migration of care workers because that's being done elsewhere, and there's quite a literature on it. So the central focus of the big project, I thought I'd give you the big project overview. The central focus of the big project is reorganization of care, and that has multiple components that I won't go into. Shifts in family systems, demographic structures, particularly the pattern of demographic aging, which is something that I've been working on, and socioeconomic structures, and how all this matters to what we're calling the huge increase in global migration of care workers, who may not intend to be care workers, but are care workers. So this is something of interest to us in the big project. The project's organized into 3 thematic domains. I won't tell you all about the project because it would take a long time, almost as long as Alex's introduction. Yegads. So the first one is the shaping and framing of care, which I'm not going into. That's not what I'm going to do. My part is the structural factors in the demand for care. So it's a macro kind of a thing, and we're going to talk about that. And then there's a thematic focus with several projects under care provisioning. So these are the people involved in the project. And of course, Glenda sits here, so she can answer all the hard questions. Poor kid. Anyway, we're just starting this, so none of us can answer the hard questions. So if you want to ask them, that would pose an interesting research agenda for us, but we can't answer everything yet. This is an international group, which makes for very interesting early morning conference calls. But nonetheless, we're going to divide it up into various components and put it together as we go along. So the deliverables for the immediate future, heaven help us, are 3. The first one is I've been invited to do a keynote symposium in the University of Southern California in January. Who can resist that, eh? So off I go to the sunshine in January. I have nothing to say yet, so I'm hoping I will by then. The overall project will have a big conference with our policy partners, and the policy partners are being quite important in this. They're international, and we're bringing them in at the ground floor because it's a partnership grant. The concept is not to do exactly the work that they wish we would do, because there's some of that, but rather to say, what are the questions that emerge in collaboration with academics and policymakers that could be addressed in collaboration? So the policy people are being involved right from the beginning. They're in Asia and in North America, in posing some of the interesting research questions. And then I've been invited to present on this at a presidential symposium at the World Congress of Sociology, so in Yokohama in July. So I'm sure hoping I've got something to say then. Okay, so what we're doing first of all in this is tying together multiple literatures, which, as many of you know, is not straightforward to do. These literatures often don't touch. So the 3 literatures that I'm going to focus on here, just briefly, touching the tops, are the care literature, migration literature, and the big one that I'm really focused on in this thing is inequalities and what that means for it. So the care literature, just mentioned briefly, and this is very briefly atop the waves of what's going on. The care literature, first of all, we presume that care is central to survival, because no newborn or disabled person, severely disabled person, or elderly person who needs attention can survive without being cared for. You know, if you're desperately ill in an emergency ward, you need care. So this notion of care being central to well-being is important. And yet, it seems that when we think about what's happening with markets and with states today, care is falling through the cracks in all kinds of ways. Child care, elder care, disabled care, coming out of hospital care. Care is simply falling through the cracks. People say, well, we presume families will do it. Well, families are all working. And so the notion, we have this full employment concept that everybody should be active in the workplace, so that's not happening. They're not there available to provide care. Dependence on care, we argue, and of course it won't surprise you because the Canada Research Chair, as Alex mentioned, has life course in the title, that is life course based, that dependence on care is a natural part of the life course. It's not something extraordinary. All children require care. They're not going to make it unless you care for them. And so that, not all older people require care, but all children do. So there's this natural part of the life course. And of course, children remain children for a very long time requiring care now. You know, they need a lot of things even when they're quite old. But anyway, that's one aspect. So there's a growing need for care for the disabled. And we know how that works because people who are disabled live a long time now, and they didn't used to live as long. So we have a lot of people who need care for a very long time, have aging parents. So that kind of issue of care is important. Now, what people talk about is a care deficit, and this is where I'm going to turn it over. Talk about a care deficit. Why are we talking about a care deficit? Because people say, and this is the script, and I'll try to unpack this as best I can, is linked to changing gender regimes. Women are working, heaven forbid, nobody providing the care. Not that care is not work, but they're working in the paid labor force. They're not sitting at home just waiting to provide care. Then, so that's a big one. But the other issue, of course, that people say, policy people around the world say, we have an aging population. They're all going to pop out of the woodwork needing care. Nobody's going to provide it because daughters and daughters-in-law are working in the paid labor force. What are we going to do? Well, we'll talk about how that is a bit fallacious as we go along. And then there's the emergence of a personal care market, paid market, presumably based on this care deficit. Now that's another issue. And then inequalities and social exclusion result from this. But we don't necessarily have them have social exclusion and inequalities as part of the lead-in to this. So that's the point that I'm focused on here. Inequalities and social exclusion result. Why? Because we bring people into the country as care workers, and then we say, well, you don't really count. You're not really part of us. You're sort of kind of on the edges. So that's the built-in policy-induced social exclusion. Come with me, mouse. If it doesn't work, then Alex can work it.
I will.
You will? Good. Not as much theorizing on transnational care work at the macro level has occurred. Quite a bit of work on the micro and meso levels, but not so much on the macro level, especially in the shifting context of inequalities. And by inequalities, I mean within countries, but also between countries globally. So that's quite an important context shaping this. So, first of all, a little bit about the global migration literature. It's always been crucial. People have always migrated. This notion that we've suddenly discovered global migration, most of us are the children of migrants, you know, either recently or going way back, or we're migrants ourselves. And what are we seeking? We're voting with our feet to seek opportunity, escape, hope, whatever. So, you know, that's what's going on in Canada, but it's also going on in other parts of the world, including countries that weren't previously settler societies where this is occurring. There's increasing global inequalities. Anybody walking the earth in 2013 knows that one. And this leads to, and this is key to the research questions that I'm posing in my project, we're posing in my project, this leads to a greater pool of people seeking mobility, social and geographic. Makes sense. You got a widening gap between the rich and the poor. You got more people at the bottom saying, hey, I got to do something about this. Where can I do it? There, not here. They scoot out somewhere. So that's an interesting kind of a phenomenon. Then migration streams, which a lot of people have been talking about for many years, exist. There's no question about it. But migrants move for a lot of different reasons. So simply looking at care migration streams doesn't tell the whole story. Why? Because this article in the recent Canadian Public Policy by Jelena Atakovich and Ivy Bourgault points out that many of the people doing care work in Canada, migrant workers doing care work in Canada, don't come on a care work migration stream. They come elsewhere. They come as family reunification. They come as nurses who can't get work. They come as doctors who can't get work. So the care work is sometimes like what we always talk about taxi drivers, highly skilled people driving taxi. They're doing care work too. So the streams don't quite work anymore. There's other literature on this, but not much. So what else have we got? To our way of thinking, it's insufficient to look at care migration streams per se. That may be only part of the story because of this growing inequality. So the inequality effects, I'm going to dwell on this because this is key as we go through, so I'm going to return to this. We know about inequality effects. They're widely known. We know about how they affect democracy. Quite a number of studies on that, recent studies. Stiglitz has a whole series now in the New York Times, I don't know whether you've seen that, on the governance and democratic effects of inequality. It's quite profound stuff. Justice, social cohesion are all affected by inequality. Productivity is affected, alienation, all these are empirically shown inequality effects. Health and well-being, we know well about that. Child development and brain function, we're beginning to understand how poverty etches itself in the brains. It actually affects the brains. So the more people you have pushed into poverty, the more effects you will have over the life course of that etching in the brain and poverty effects. The list goes on, so I won't go into all of it. The overview, and this is quite important here to understand, the standard script of care suggests that it's premised on care deficit, and that's what people focus on. We don't have enough people to provide care. We got all these people needing care. What shall we do? Henny penny, sky is going to fall in. So the standard script goes like this, and we all know it. Population aging, and I'm never sure how to spell aging, so I spell it various ways in various places. But my latest book spells it with an E because it was published in the UK, so we're going with that for now. Drives the Americans crazy, which is fine. More people in the paid work, more women in paid work, so they're not available for caregiving. Changing families, more divorce, more mobility, blah, 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 more everything in families changed. And increased transnational mobility, which means that families are not all in one place. The aging parents are here, the daughters-in-law are here. It is hard to provide care across thousands of kilometers or the other part of the world, so that kind of issue leads to increased demand for care. That's the standard script. Therefore, there's more demand for paid care because all this is happening. So you've got to have paid care. So this is how we get caught in it. Here's this woman, and it's gendered for the most part. There are men who provide care, but we're not going into that because it's a gendered script for the most part. So here she is with a spoon in each hand, handling both little ones and older ones. And of course, the notion is she's working too. And she's pretty spiffy, dressed up in her nice shoes and everything, so probably she is working. And she can't handle it. So what do? We bring up a Super Mona caregiver from Asia. And this is the standard script. Sorry, Alan. I'm trying to see everybody. So this is the standard script, that the care deficit leads to this kind of phenomenon. So the alternative script, and this is the one that we have our research questions buried in, is that growing income inequalities, both national and international. You control your mouse? Good mouse. Growing income inequalities, plus growing politics around the world with respect to immigrants and immigration, leads to internal supplies of potential care workers who are also transnational, and I want to give one example about this, but may not be openly so. And there are clear examples of this in the United States, which I'm going to focus on as one example, but they're also in other countries. There's this kind of undocumented sort of potential for caregivers who are transnational but not openly so. And because of the inequalities, a growing international supply of potential care workers. Because there's all these people at the bottom who want mobility. How do you get mobility? Big demand for care work, boom, you go into care work. Super Mona. So demand for care and the care deficit script is built on 3 pillars. The growth in older populations worldwide, presuming they're all going to need care. And we'll unpack that. They don't, but we'll unpack that. Decline in birth rates and family size leads to fewer potential caregivers with larger numbers of older relatives. That's the kind of tree thing. So you know, the birth rate goes down, this is over the life course. You've got this tree of older adults because the birth rate was higher in the past, narrow stem to care for them, so you're looking up and you see all these people and you say, oh my goodness, it's like an oak tree. And it's a decline in availability of potential caregivers, more women in paid labor force, and greater mobility. Those are the 3 pillars. The linear script, lack of supply of traditional homegrown family caregivers leads to commodification and transnationalization of care. Because we can't find people who want to provide care at home, we say, in domestic markets. Questionable assumption. So both transnationalism and aging are much more complex than this linear script typically looks at. So let's look at both of those just briefly. Transnationalism is a growth area. Most everybody knows that in research. But there's multi-stranded relations, both social and economic, that link societies of origin and the societies of settlement. It's not so straightforward that people just go out of their society of origin and boom, forget it, leave it behind. Not the way it works. And it's not going to work that in the care script either. So we have economic transnationalism where remittances go back to the origin society. Philippines would be a classic example of that, where a good percentage of the economy of the Philippines depends on remittances. So that means they have to send workers out, not only care workers, that's an important part of it, but also people that work on ships around the world. They're very often Filipinos who send the money back. So economic transnationalism, that's just one example. Then there's social transnationalism, which involves cross-border cultures and families that have transnational identities. Now, our focus is not on identity per se, but if we look at social transnationalism, it means that there's an aspect of that may be quite important to the inequality script we're looking at. And then there's political transnationalism, and this almost never hits the research agenda, but it's there. So for example, we have a number of people in Canada from elsewhere who vote in those elections elsewhere. We've even had people who've run for office from here, including presidents of various countries, who have run from office as Canadians in their homelands. It's a fascinating kind of a phenomenon, and something that I think has not been disentangled very well. Transnationalism, just a little bit more. Transnational social spaces can shape identities different from ethnic or immigrant identities, because essentially a foot in both camps creates a quite different identity than a hyphenated Canadian who is here because they're totally, completely an immigrant. These transnational identities are decidedly mixed. And we've seen a lot of this recently. There's a fluidity between back there and here, so caring might be back and forth. It might not be in one place only. And then this is particularly liquid, perhaps, for temporary workers and the undocumented. Particularly important, and undocumented immigration is quite important in the United States, but also in other countries, not so much in Canada, but in Europe it's an issue. And breadwinning can trump parenting. Breadwinning, when I've said this to other audiences, they say, oh, no. But what I'm saying here is that if people are pushed to the bottom in an unequal distribution, that they say, well, I've got to earn a living, and I'm going to earn a living there because I can't earn it here, so I'm going to leave my kids behind and go there to earn a living. So caregivers do that, but other people do that too and send the money home. So in essence, they're not hands-on parents. So they substitute breadwinning for caring, if you like. It's a kind of an interesting trade-off. And then there's astronaut households, which we've talked about a lot with respect to some people in East Asia that are literally back and forth with a foot in both camps. Sometimes the children live here, the parents live there. They're a foot in both camps, and literally with not a firm foot in either. So what about aging? Aging is also much more complex. All societies are aging, but not in the same way. So even less developed parts of the world are aging, and aging pretty quickly, but their top age is not the same as our top age. So that means they're older, younger. There's all kinds of aspects of that going on. So there's care needs in other parts of the world than more developed countries. Very severe care needs because they're older, younger, and because they have issues like the HIV/AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa, but there are other issues going on. So this concept of migration streams only going in one direction, no, I think they're going in multiple directions. It's like a tango. And older populations are highly diverse, and this is totally overlooked when governments say everybody's going to be above a certain age, as if everybody above a certain age is going to need care. They're not. Most people do not need care, and if they do need care, they need it in the last few years or days of their lives even. So there's an awful lot of misunderstanding about that. We also vary hugely by socioeconomic status, ethnicity, immigration status, family structures, all kinds of things are happening there. And most elderly, I would say, do not need care, unlike children who all need care up to a certain age. It's a different life course script. So policies on care also are highly, highly diverse across more developed countries. So transnationalism and aging are kind of headed toward each other, but in very, very complex ways which we're trying to untangle. So now I want to talk just a little bit about this example. Now I realize it's only one example, but it's a compelling example. Vastly growing income inequalities in the United States. All over the papers, everybody knows this. In Canada too, but not as much. US is just huge. Mean income in the middle has stayed stable for about 3 decades. Poverty is deepening. The rich get filthy richer, and the further you go up to the top 0.1% of the 1% gets even higher. So they're doing really well at the top, but everybody else is kind of either stable or going down. So what does this mean? You have a huge supply of potential caregivers, because there's all those people at the bottom can't find work, care work can do, right? So through politics and policies, I would argue, many at the bottom are transnationals in the US, perhaps undocumented, but within one country, and if they are undocumented, hidden. Where best to hide but in a house? You can hide with an employer paying you privately. Nobody can catch you for being undocumented. It's a perfect setup. And that's exactly what's happening. But this is really interesting. This article in 2011 was looking at explaining this mysterious puzzle of why in the world birth rates can be so much higher in the US than in most other developed countries when they don't have any support. They have practically no parental leave, no social benefits for having children. How can this be? They found the answer in inequality. The Marketization Hypothesis these people found is something, and I'm gonna try to just put it very, very briefly. Essentially it says, is it better for me as a mother to go out to work and make money, or to hire somebody to look after my kids? What's better for me economically? And if you consider income inequality, men tend to marry women, or women tend to marry men who are the same socioeconomic status. So those people are earning a lot of money. In fact, they're earning double because they're highly paid, both of them. So the notion for her up here to take time out, who takes time out to have kids? Anyway, whatever. Take time away from paid work to look after the kids when she has all this earning power, not going to happen, because she can hire cheap labor to look after the kids. And she can have more kids. because she can hire the cheap labor. That's what they found. That explains the higher birth rate in the US among highly educated women, because it's anomalous. It doesn't occur anyplace else. So you work with that for a minute, and you realize this pool of potential cheap labor within the inequalities in the states can drive demand. So it's supply driving demand. And immediately we have an interesting hypothesis nobody's looked at. So this kind of drove this agenda to this big project, this partnership project, that affluent couples with marital homogamy, marrying well-educated men, highly paid men, marrying highly paid women, both working, hiring cheap labor, can drive their desired family size being realized and higher birth rates than any other place in the world because of that inequality. So I'm saying, works there. Let's see if it works in other countries. Let's see what's going on. So that's what we're doing. And then we're going to see if it's working around the world. Now, the interesting aspect about that is if they have higher birth rates, they have less population aging in the long run, so less need to bring in care workers, but that's down the way. That's the true life course way down the way. So greater complexities yet, and this is what gets really interesting. Global inequalities here have led to people in less developed countries who need income, older people in less developed countries who need income, migrating as labor care workers to more developed countries. And I discovered this when it became apparent to me that a lot of the care workers, I shouldn't say a lot, a significant number of the care workers to older Germans are older Polish women. And you see them sit, I saw a picture of them sitting there holding hands on a sofa. They're both the same age pretty well. But as older Polish women who don't have pensions, can't find work in Poland, they're migrating to Germany to take care of older Germans. This is not part of that linear script we're talking about here in the beginning. So that's very interesting. And it's also true that more developed country elders are migrating to less developed countries in order to have a better climate and to have cheap care to look after them. And you see this particularly in Asia. Japanese are doing this, Koreans are doing this, migrating to Vietnam, to Indonesia. You know, you get cheap care and you get a great climate and maybe not bad food. But so that kind of migration is going on. And then that's where more developed elders become the transnationals, not the care workers always. So this is a really complex script. That's why we got to have 5 years to do this. So for a deeper and broader understanding, and I'm getting close to the end here, so I won't go on as much as Alex here. For a deeper and broader understanding of the intersections of old age and transnationalism with respect to care, the main question I guess we're asking is, can we see transnational care as supply-driven? And the hints are that there's an agenda there, that it is supply-driven to some extent. And we have to assess the extent and in which country and under which regimes and how that works. But that has not been looked at. And one of the colleagues on this grant, it was kind of funny, she said when she first heard me talking about this 2.5 years ago when we were first writing the first grant that got adjudicated, and then we got on the short list, we had to rewrite the whole thing by an encyclopedia by the time you get done. But on the other hand, it's lots of money. She said when she first heard me talking about this, she didn't get it. But then she said she started looking around and suddenly she thought, yeah, inequality can produce a supply of potential caregivers. It's right there. But we still don't know how this works, so we're going to look at it. How does income inequality and its growth drive care demand in both more developed countries and less developed countries and globally? These are big questions, but this is macro level. And then what matters most here? Aging, shrinking families, force of transnational mobilities, public policies, income inequalities. We're going to try to look at all that. But we're starting with income inequalities. So, I just want to mention this because this is another study, results from another study that was originally published earlier this year in French. This is from my US-Canada study, but this is important here, this bolded in part, that growing income inequalities may have serious and direct negative implications for cohorts transitioning in future to mid to later life. Now what we're getting at there and we're not getting at that yet in this grant, in the new grant, but we're beginning to say income inequalities will have implications going forward for those people who are suffering in terms of their needs for care. So it's another kind of supports the linear script, but it adds a new dimension. You see how this can work. And in this case, this was longitudinal, so we followed these individuals for a period of time in Canada. This is in Canada, we'd also did that in the US. So we know the inequality script is big. Now Leanne will smile at this because she's been helping me hugely to round up these data, but we got most of them now. So the first empirical steps are gathering comparable time series data from these countries. We don't have Japan yet because they're not part of this where the income is cross-nationally equivalent. But we got all the others. At least we got ways to get the others, and we have access to them. So the first step here would be to look at within-country income inequalities over time for those countries, and then to control for population aging, which we can do. We can age standardize. It's a standard technique. And look at growth in care work. And by care work, we're going to define it pretty broadly here. We might exclude healthcare work. We might not, but we'll have to consider that. And then look at between country income inequalities and migration patterns among these countries. And then put all of that into the context of country policies on immigration, out-migration, because some places have policies on out-migration. And specifically, the Philippines is a classic example of this, specifically train people to out-migrate, to do care work and other work in the transnational realm. And then the next steps remain to be determined. I mentioned this is not empirical because we're just starting. So there we are.